button so we can get great. Good evening. I'd like to welcome both uh, Craig Devoto and Dr. Megan Hopkins to the 2016-2017 AER Connect series. Tonight we will be focusing on Every Student Successful Act, the ESSA. And what I'd like to do first is certainly introduce myself. I am Naomi Lawrence Lee, the Connect co-chair, and I'm a Texas Southern graduate doctoral student here in Houston, Texas. And we also have Jessica Swartz, who is the Connect series co-chair, who's unable to be with us tonight. And she is a third-year doctoral student at the George Mason University. So what I will do is just kind of state some real brief information about AERA. I guess I'll call it our PSA. And it's that AER's Division A focus is on administration, organization, and leadership. The Graduate Student Division of AERA's goal is to strengthen and broaden the graduate school experience for Division A. Students, by bringing grad students, scholars, researchers, policymakers in the field of educational leadership. So the Connect series tonight, again, our focus again is on ESSA. And so for those that may be joining us live, certainly they're already here, but then if later, they can always post questions to our Twitter or to our Facebook. I'd like to certainly first start off by thanking our panelists tonight, in which we have, first up, we have Craig DeVito from the University of Illinois at Chicago. Craig, you want to say hello and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So yes, my name is Craig, and I'm a third-year doctoral student at UIC, and I mainly study federal education policy. So that's kind of my favorite thing to look at. I've been looking at the intersection of teacher prep and leadership prep, specifically in federal education policy, and how that's kind of playing out right now. And my dissertation is specifically on the EdTPA, which is becoming a very popular teacher prep test. Yeah, I'm a former teacher turned researcher. So, yeah.
Okay, well, great. Thank you. Next, we have Dr. Megan Hopkins from the University of California at San Diego. Dr. Hopkins, would you say hello and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks. I'm an assistant professor at the University of California at San Diego, like Naomi said. My primary focus is on thinking about how to design and organize education systems for equity, and particularly for supporting English learners and multilingual, bilingual students. And through that work, I've been involved with the working group on ELL policy, which worked really closely with folks on the Hill to revise NCLB within ESSA for language learners.
Well, great. What our objective tonight is to have answer some essential questions. I do believe that you all probably received kind of a little backdrop of what our questions were going to be tonight. And I'll try to stick as close to that script as possible. And so I'll ask the questions, and either one of you can certainly feel free to respond for the future viewers that will be looking at this particular video session. And the first question we have is, what is ESSA?
I guess I can chime in. Basically, ESSA, I just call it ESSA. It's just much easier. ESSA. So okay. ESSA is the new reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was started in 1965 under Lyndon Johnson. And its kind of main goal was to really promote those with high need students. So not necessarily specifically minorities, although it was kind of used in that way, but they specifically for low income students. And Title I is kind of the popular one everyone tends to hear about, but there's actually a lot of titles, though the most money goes to Title I. And so No Child Left Behind, which was around for 15 years, so had a long go there. Usually they're reauthorized about every 5-ish years, so this was a real long stretch. And that kind of created some political turmoil. But we have a new law, and it's definitely a big difference from NCLB, and that we'll obviously talk about that. But that's it in a nutshell, and it's basically how the federal government manipulates policy given a federalist standpoint in terms of states' rights. And they get about 10% of their money, states that is, from the federal government via this act.
Okay, all right. Dr. Hopkins, you want to chime in?
Sure. I would add that, as Craig said, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, as he said, came to be in order to really support the needs of low-income students or students from low-income communities, and has evolved over time to supporting the needs of sort of underserved schools and students writ large. So, for example, the Bilingual Education Act, which used to be separate from the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, was moved into the legislation under Title III. So Craig was talking about Title I, and Title I focuses primarily on students receiving free and reduced price lunch, so students from low-income families and communities. Title II focuses primarily on teacher professional development. Title III focuses on entitlements for English learners, bilingual students, and so on and so on. And we could go through the other titles, but those are the ones that I have the most expertise on and maybe of the most interest to folks listening to this. And I would say, as Craig said, with No Child Left Behind ushered in a new wave of accountability measures. I think that's an important thing to note. For schools, that was new with No Child Left Behind. So schools and school districts were being held accountable for performance according to state tests. And so it really sort of marshaled this focus on standards and testing in a way that, as we've seen, and as I'm sure many people have read, has had some detrimental effects on the instruction that students receive, and particularly students in Title I schools, for example, schools receiving Title I funds. We've seen shifts in their instruction in a way that has been less focused on problem solving and more focused on sort of basic skills in order, because of the pressures that teachers feel and schools feel to pass the tests. And so ESSA has in some ways lessened accountability, but has really held those provisions in the law and has made some adjustments that have provided more flexibility to states and to schools. But it has in many ways maintained those provisions that focus on holding schools accountable for students' performance based on standardized tests.
Okay. And as we consider, as Craig has said, the acronym ESSA, with the schools having the flexibility, what do you believe the impact it will have on states with trying to improve student outcomes? Because certainly states are being given, I guess, as you stated, the flexibility with some of the indicators of when they get ready to measure which schools have really done well and which have not done so well.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to put it in context for those who might listen and not know this, that under No Child Left Behind, schools were held accountable, as I said, for essentially measures of achievement on standardized tests in language arts and mathematics primarily. Science came in, sort of was phased in later, and at certain grade levels and time points across the K-12 span. And so there were very particular ways that schools were measured on their performance under Title I, and then under Title III, provisions for English language proficiency for language learners were one of the measures and ways that schools were tracked for their performance specific to English learners. And what ESSA did was allow states more flexibility in terms of what those measures are that they use to hold schools accountable for students' performance. So the new law requires that there be a series of measures included in each state's what might be called a dashboard. So those would be things like achievement test scores and English language proficiency growth and levels. But states have the opportunity to also provide now measures of opportunities to learn. So those could be things like resources to schools, funding, highly qualified teachers, however that might be defined. A variety of dropout, for example, course taking at the high school level, for example, enrollment in AP courses. And so it really marks an opportunity for states to develop a more robust dashboard in terms of what they expect of schools. But what really remains to be seen is whether states will take up that charge in ways that really create more equitable systems or not, or will it be will they just, for lack of sort of infrastructure expertise, just take up the old system? Will they change some of the measures, but it'll be same wine, different bottle? So those are kind of the questions that we don't know the answers to yet. And I'd love to hear from Craig in terms of what he thinks.
Yeah, I definitely really agree with that. I think in theory, the idea of ESSA is to essentially kind of turn back the clock. So NCLB, very high accountability, all about standards, all about putting sanctions on schools that were not meeting certain benchmarks. And with ESSA, we're seeing a massive retreat of federal accountability. And in effect, it's like a real laissez-faire attitude. And this has actually been done before under this federal law of ESSA. It was done in the 80s, and they did these what were called lump sum categorical grants, and that's kind of coming back again. And so, at least me personally, I fear because if we look at the historical record then, that states, while they were given the opportunity to use the money in the way they saw fit, they didn't use it properly because there wasn't that guidance. And so what I think we need is almost like a balance. So NCB was, I think we all kind of can agree it was harsh. And that doesn't necessarily work. But with ESSA, I also agree this idea of will they do it? And the issue, I think, is that so the government, because of their real hands-off now under ESSA, they've created these documents which are called non-regulatory guidance, and I can actually share these. I
Okay.
pull them up, so I'll put these up. So this is one of the ones they came out with, and I can give these to you to like post with the webinar if you want to. But this is kind of how the government is trying to say, hey, this is what you should be doing right now. And so states currently are working on their 5-year plan, if you will, of how are they going to meet this law. And so this non-regulatory guidance is kind of their way of nudging them. But under the law, at the very end of the law, it says literally the secretary cannot basically enforce anything. And so it all falls on the states. And right now, 70% of funding disparities are between states. And so states that don't necessarily have the capacities or the funding, personnel, or just literal dollars to do these sort of changes might have a much harder time than others that are in a better position. And we kind of saw this recently with the Race to the Top grants.
Right.
So for those that are familiar with those, basically states via a competitive grant process were able to get extra money on top of what they got from the federal government via ESSA. And those states that had great capacities and were able to kind of put forth an appropriate plan got the lion's share of the funds. And so my fear is under this that kind of a similar thing is going to happen. States that are in a great position and already are going to do good things. And that's great. But is every state going to now with their new freedom? And I don't know. And now the other thing is that I think is kind of important to note is there in the ESSA, there's a lot more language in terms of talking about specifically school choice. And they're trying to introduce that again. And with the Trump administration, I know that's one of his big platform goals. And while the law kind of prevents the federal government from enforcing it, the door is being opened without necessarily the empirical evidence that shows that is a major game changer. And so we'll see what's going to happen with that specifically.
Okay. So just given the non-regulatory, I guess, issue that you mentioned with the federal government not being able to put the muscle to the state governments for the enforcement of it. As we consider the student learning and certainly, as Dr. Hopkins mentioned, even the bilingual, the impact, although the states have the flexibility, who's there to ensure that it's going to be successful? And certainly, when we consider the impact, how is that going to impact even the teachers? Because something you mentioned, Dr. Hopkins, said highly qualified teachers, and how do we define that? Because it's certainly, that's not, I guess, a national definition. Would I be correct in saying that? Somewhat left up to probably, each state and then the local school district, how they define and certainly recruit those teachers. One of the other items here, as we look at the impact, is when you mentioned about, Craig, about the non-regulatory, maybe somewhat consider some of the potential risk that we could see schools having to face with ESSA, with the local. So would you guys like to discuss that?
Yeah, sure. Me personally, on that note, I come from kind of an organizational policy background, and so that's kind of how I look at things. And when I look at the newest law, ESSA, in terms of federal educational policy, in terms of capacity building, like language, they haven't included any more than they previously did. And they percentage for capacity building, so like administrative support, technical support, those sort of things, hasn't actually increased. I think it's like less than 3% or something about that, which isn't necessary. Sometimes you need to spend half your money. I remember for the Race to the Top grant, Connecticut spent almost nearly all their Race to the Top funding on capacity building to actually improve what they were doing there. And they got a lot of flack for that from people in the state, because they're like, well, why isn't that money going to my student? Well, people don't really realize that sometimes you need all of that money just to make sure what you're doing is done right. And if it's not done right, then it's not going to matter. Not to bash on the non-regulatory guidance. I think there's some really good things on it. They're talking about using evidence, the idea of scientifically based evidence. That was a huge problem under NCLB. They didn't really discuss what scientifically based research was, and it created a massive storm for education researchers, for people implementing policy, and they've really kind of tightened the reins on that in the non-regulatory guidance. And so I really applaud them for that, and kind of talking about what that looks like. And they have kind of different tiers. And the states that are making these plans have to include these certain tiers. And it's by far and away, way better than under the previous law. And they've done a really good job of explaining that. I think the Department of Education really saw that was a shortcoming in the previous law, and has really set out to kind of improve that. But again, it's all on the states. They can put these plans out there, and the states don't have to follow them whatsoever, even under Race to the Top, which I keep going back to because it kind of became almost like a new federal policy, because NCLB was kind of being pushed out the door in the last 5 years before the new one came, and that kind of became a new one, so to speak. And they didn't really, a lot of states haven't followed through on actually what they said they were going to do. And so if that's any indication of what might happen under ESSA, then we may not see quite the gains. That said, I think the law itself is a heck of a lot better than NCLB. it's a step in the right direction after realizing, whoa, we put way too much accountability. We need to step that back. There's way too much testing. So they've really tried to curb that. But as far as giving necessarily the guidance and technical support needed, I'm not sure it's quite there yet. But I think we got the ball bouncing in a different direction that might be helpful, and come next iteration and more as we kind of tighten things up, I think it could be on the road to a different and better federal education policy.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Dr. Hopkins?
Yeah, I guess I would just add that related to sort of the capacity building efforts, I think something that's important to keep in mind that was obviously a problem under No Child Left Behind is, a one-size-fits-all federal education law doesn't work when you have really different state and context and local context within states. So thinking about English learners and bilingual education in particular, you have states that have historically served large populations of language learners, like California, where I live, and you have states that have never, or I shouldn't say never, but have not in recent years served linguistic minority students and are maybe considered new immigrant destinations where they're experiencing a dramatic increase in the number of students identified as language learners. So states in the Midwest, states in the South in particular would fall in that category. And thinking about how do you implement a federal law that sort of mandates using the same measures of performance for all students when you have very different needs within states, and then even within those states, you have very different locales, the urban and rural divide, suburban communities that have very different local resources and community supports for education. And so I think something that's important to keep in mind whenever you're thinking about implementing a federal law is at the state level is thinking about allowing enough flexibility to capture that local context. And I think that's what's sort of so hard about the technical assistance that is provided is how do you provide technical assistance in a way that is sort of embedded in local contexts and meaningful to the educators that are serving the students in those communities. And in the same way aren't coming from a deficit perspective and thinking about how to serve these communities well. I think that's something that we haven't answered even with this federal law, though it does allow more flexibility and allows states to think about different measures for improvement. I don't know that we're still not really considering sort of the local variations that are at play.
Okay. And certainly those are areas for us to all consider, the educators and the researchers, as we look at the new ESSA and how it's going to impact. One of the statements that you made, Craig, was about the scientific evidence of what is actually happening based on the non-regulatory and certainly some of the indicators with ESSA as we look at what's worked and what hasn't worked. And even as we go forward, some things are, I guess, just kind of being repackaged. And for us to be able to distinguish the difference, if we have some type of scientific evidence to look at as it relates to ESSA and the No Child Left Behind.
So just to kind of expand on the scientific, I found the tiers specifically that they have. They have 4 different tiers. So the first tier that they've decided kind of this is what states should be using their evidence. So whatever they use to create these plans that they're working on right now to submit to the federal government, and I think a few states have submitted them. I could be wrong on that, but I think most are just still working on them. And it begins with tier 1, which is called quote unquote strong evidence. So it's one well-designed and well-implemented experimental study. So they refer to it as a randomized controlled trial, and that's always kind of been considered the gold standard. That's not always feasible, especially when you're dealing with policies. And that became a big problem under NCLB because that was kind of considered that is what scientific-based research is. And if you're not doing that, then you're not doing research in the eyes of the government. So they've kind of scaled back. They still say that's the top one, but obviously not everything can be randomized and controlled. So then you have tier 2, which is moderate evidence. And so this is at least one well-designed and well-implemented quasi-experimental study. So the idea that, okay, we can't do it completely randomized, but we can at least be more acute in terms of how we're going to select cases for a study. And then we have tier 3, which is a well-designed and well-implemented correlational study that controls for selection bias. And so those are kind of the big 3. And then the last one is demonstrates a rationale. So that idea that there's some sort of close relationship. So the activity, strategy, or intervention demonstrates a rationale based on high quality research or a positive evaluation that suggests that is likely to improve student or other relevant outcomes. And so they kind of consider that the last one, it makes the cut, but they definitely want the first 3.
Right. Okay. Well, that is certainly good information for us to all consider with the tiers, and as we look at certainly education being equitable and certainly having student success, because ultimately that is the goal of the policies being made so that students can be successful, and particularly those that are in low socioeconomic backgrounds. And so as we look at ESSA and certainly the issues and thinking about the policies with Race to the Top and No Child Left Behind, I wonder what will be the role that the teachers will be able to play with the I guess I would consider the environment or the culture of the schools with the local law, and then as it dwindles down to the local communities, of how this will also play a role for their involvement for it to be successful. Any comments you want to add on that?
I can continue, I guess. In terms of that specifically with teachers, because I've looked a lot at the new Title II specifically of ESSA. That's kind of been where my newest stream of research has been. And they've really backed off to such a great extent that they've essentially left it up to states. They've made some small definitions of like, what is a preparation program, kind of what do they call that? What does a leadership program look like? They've done some real subtle definitions, but nothing. They're really leaving everything to states. And that can be a recipe for great things, or it can be a real recipe for not good things. And I think we're in the next 5 years or so, we're really going to see our state's going to step up to the plate. Are they going to use this? I'll put it this way. I don't think states are complaining about ESSA after NCLB. When the waivers came out and the Obama administration gave essentially waiving the NCLB kind of sanctions. States were thrilled and almost all of them applied, and almost all were accepted. They were thrilled about it because they were sweating because they didn't want to have any sort of sanctions for their districts or schools, and went out of their way, in fact, to protect a lot of their local school districts by setting really low bars for what a highly qualified teacher even is. So that idea of a highly qualified teacher, which we were talking about earlier, didn't even matter in the end. So they were talking about, I think by the end of NCLB, it was like 98% were considered highly qualified. But what does that mean again? There were 50 different definitions, and then whatever the territories said too. And okay, they're highly qualified, but did that actually change teaching? The research would say, no, not really. And so if we kind of see that again under ESSA of this, okay, you create your own definition, but you don't actually create one that will make change, and change within context, because I also agree that's super, super important and very tough. The one size fits all doesn't work. We really know that from political science, especially. And so will that play out? And again, we just don't know. This coming year is when we're really going to start to see ESSA being applied, and I don't know. I wish I knew.
Okay, okay. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Dr. Hopkins?
Yeah, so something to think about too when thinking about sort of this evidence of effectiveness and what it means to implement a program that is empirically based is none of those definitions highlight the need for that program to be well implemented. And so what does that mean to be well implemented? And that goes back to what Craig initially talked about in terms of developing systems, right? Paying attention to the organization and the systems that support implementation of these programs. So yeah, let's select this curriculum that is evidence-based and has been, people have taken it through randomized controlled trials and shown that it's, effective for all students. But okay, so let's just take the curriculum, but then you have to support a system for teachers to implement it, to learn how to implement it for their particular students, for leaders to figure out how to support teachers in that work, district leaders to develop the infrastructures, the assessments, the resources to support it. And so you also have to think about really that guidance and technical assistance and those resources, and how do you allocate them in ways that support teachers on the ground. And something that's just kind of sitting in the back of my mind right now as the Electoral College just made Donald Trump president-elect is how do we make sense of the kind of instruction that we've been supporting in our schools for at least the last decade in terms of basic skills and so lack of attention to socio-emotional learning and lack of attention toward things like empathy for other people that have led us to these circumstances where children of color and children of immigrants are going to school and experiencing hate and experiencing racism from other children. How have we created a system that does that? And how is our new education law gonna matter if our schools look like that? So it's just something that as we've been talking, it's just been in the back of my head, and it's just, something I've been really thinking about. And how do we use the resources that we have to create systems that are more equitable for students, all students, white students as well, to develop skills and understandings of the world around them and how it's changing. And how do we support teachers in that work? Teachers, are always at least in the last decade, again, have been sort of blamed for lack of change in schools. And we really need to think about how are we supporting teachers and systems to do this work when they have kids coming to school and are being told that, they need to go back home to their country. How do you reckon with all of this sort of in the current context while you're implementing the new law? I don't know.
Craig, anything you have to say in regards to the effects, I guess, of policy?
Yeah, I totally agree. I do think that idea of basic skills is continuing to be pushed. And we're still on that track of standards-based reform, and we have been for a long time. And I agree with the social emotional learning and these other intangibles that kind of get looked past, or something as basic as writing isn't pushed. So we got reading and math being pushed, and those are very important, but writing might be the most important skill of all of them. If you can't communicate via an email, you're in real trouble. So these things just haven't necessarily been pushed because we're looking at metrics often. We're always looking at numbers. What is the reading score? What's the RIT score of somebody? What's this score of somebody? And then comparing them. And while that does give some important evidence and data for teachers, it's not the only thing that matters. And I do think that's missing from the federal laws, this idea of, there are other sorts of data out there, and it doesn't just have to be what particular reading and math scores are on whatever the state decided to be their particular test metric.
Right, Right. Wow. Well, we certainly have our work to do. I mean, as it relates to policy, and certainly in the local school districts, from the state legislatures of what the laws that they're going to pass, and certainly how they fund the schools. Um, and I would believe that as local school board members are, certainly being elected, for those people to be in touch with what is actually happening in the community. Because one of the things you said, Dr. Hopkins, of the racial tensions that we're facing today in America. I mean, I think they're more common now than they were ever before. And certainly you have federal laws, but if when it dwindles down and it's left up to the states to ensure that those local, agencies are carrying out their duties, I mean, who's guiding that? Who's the guiding force? If it's not that those people that are elected, to serve, are in touch with what those issues are, and certainly trying to understand a policy. And certainly one of the things that was stated, we'll be able to see in the upcoming year and years to come, the impact that ESSA will have. Certainly, we want to all believe that it can be positive, but we know there's a lot of work because we have the NCLB to look back at and see the things that it did well, and like you said, the things that it did not do so well. And for the local school districts, or for the states, to see how that transition is going to go from the NCLB, and how it's going to affect the funding for ESSA, as the money is put in the state's hands for them to actually appropriate it to the local governing bodies. So I guess my question is, how do you believe the transition will be? How will it affect funding as it moves from the No Child Left Behind to the ESSA and the accountability system?
So oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you, Craig. So I'm trying to remember. Part of the sort of sanctions and funding are going to be targeted to, is it the bottom 5% of schools?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
According to the new state systems of accountability, the bottom 5% of schools will be the focus for, they don't call it this, but I guess trying to turn around efforts, and will receive sort of more resources and support than other schools. So it used to be sort of focused at the district, and sort of this is removing some of the district level focus into the school level. And in a lot of ways, my understanding is a lot of the funding is essentially sort of state to school versus state to district like it used to be. So the accountability is more school level than district level. And I'm echoing, so I'm...
Okay. We can't hear you.
I turned it off because I was echoing. Craig, do you want to add?
I thought Craig was trying to speak. I couldn't hear him.
I can't hear him either.
I can't hear him. I think he may have come unplugged. I think he's looking now.
Okay, is that better?
Much better, thank you.
Okay, cool. So that is one to kind of go back to what we were talking about. It is kind of far more local level. I really noticed in the law there's a real push for action on the ground, so to speak. So they're really moving away from sort of state level systems. So for example, like teacher prep programs and leadership programs, those are kind of being pushed aside for more helping leaders and teachers already on the ground. So there's and that's not to say that's a bad thing. It's definitely kind of a difference from past laws of this idea of okay, it starts with the states and then it kind of filters and funnels through the rest of the people. And so that could make a really great difference. The students will actually maybe see more what the funding can do. But my only argument to that would be like, if you don't look at how you're preparing these leaders and teachers for the next generation, and I feel like the law is definitely for teacher prep and principal prep isn't not quite doing enough, then down the line, a decade from now, that could really lead to major issues too. But really, there are issues everywhere. It's really tough. I don't have the answers. If I did, everyone would know my name. So.
Well, we certainly know that we have issues that are going to have to be faced, and certainly, as you talked about the teacher prep and who's monitoring that, because the future leaders, if we're not, I guess, really putting some sure processes in place to ensure that they're trained adequately and have the resources and the technical capacity to be able to handle they're not millennials anymore. I can't forget what this new generation is called, the ones that are coming.
Gen Z, I think.
Gen Z. To be prepared for them. But certainly, we realize that, the federal government has its task, and they certainly put this policy together. And now for the states, and as you mentioned, for the state, for the money to be funded from the state and go to the schools so that the action can be on the ground, so that they can actually encourage education quality and certainly student success. Is there anything else you all would like to add? Because our time is almost up here with the ESSA, Every Student Succeeds Act.
Yeah, I think something, given my interest and expertise in English learner education, something that's going to be important to watch is the provisions that were once in Title III related to English language proficiency, performance, and growth have been moved into Title I. So it's going to behoove schools and states to figure out how to align their content standards with their language proficiency standards in ways that make sense under Title I, and thinking about their accountability dashboards and how they're going to align those two in that system. And then secondarily, thinking about how funding might differ based on the fact that English language proficiency is now within Title I.
Okay. And certainly the accountability system, that's the whole focal point of this ESSA. Craig, was there anything that you wanted to add? I think we lost his voice again. We almost had him back.
You got it?
Okay, there we go.
Oh, okay. All right. So a lot of my recent looking at ESSA hasn't been so much in Title I, but Title II. And I will say that they've really beefed up Title II, even since NCLB, and that's encouraging. We're starting to, I think, kind of recognize that professional development, teacher prep, leadership, professional development, and leadership preparation to be a leader is important. and they're starting to, and I think that's one of the big takeaways for me and looking at it was that they're starting to realize that those things matter, and it's not just giving money to particular schools for whatever. They're starting to kind of structure some things a little bit more. Now it is still a categorical grant, so states can do whatever they want, and I think we're going to kind of see, well, our state's going to use it for the right purposes. We certainly hope so. That goes for English language learners, to high achievers, to or high performers, to very at-risk students. And is it going to make a difference? States have a huge opportunity, I think. I certainly hope they capitalize on it, because in the event, say they don't, we could see a kind of a yo-yo effect of kind of retreating back to an NCLB style. That's kind of one of my big gripes of the federal education policy itself under ESSA, is that we kind of have gone with high accountability to low accountability, and we kind of do this almost like pendulum shift, or like a high tide, low tide type deal. And I'd really like to get off that track. So I'm hoping we stay off of it.
Okay. Well, listen, on behalf of the Connect series, I'd like to thank both Craig Devoto and Dr. Megan Hopkins for joining us tonight as our panelists. I'd also like to remind the audience, as they look at this video, that our next Connect series will take place January 2017, next year, where we will be discussing social justice leadership. Also, remember to follow us on Twitter at Division AGSC, on Facebook at AERA Division A Graduate Students, and our webpage at aeradivision.a.org. And click on the Graduate Student Corner. And there you'll find important information about events being planned for the 2017 AERA Convention in April in San Antonio, Texas, including the Dialogical Forum, where graduate students receive high-quality mentoring opportunity with scholars in our field, and certainly information about the Foster Polite Scholarship Award of $500 for grad students who are presenting in San Antonio to help with their travel expenses. All brought to you by hardworking Division A Graduate Student Committee. Also, you'll find a call for graduate student manuscripts related to past and future Connect Series topics to be published in our January newsletter. So get those in, and we love to hear from you. And again, on behalf of Jessica, she's not with us. We'd like to, again, thank you, Dr. Megan Hopkins and Craig Devoto. And I hope you all have a Merry Christmas.
You too.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you, and good night.
Bye now.